Hi everyone, welcome back to Serger Tip Clips. Well, in my series of 3 tip clips on seam allowance, I had so many great questions and comments, and a lot of them led me to the same conclusion that we need to talk about some of the basic components in all sergers, whether you have an overlock only or a combo overlock cover stitch machine. And what we're going to concentrate on today is the stitch finger. And the reason for that is that when I do in-person events, and basically in my Serger Essentials class, when we go over a lot of the parts and pieces on the serger, and I get to the stitch finger, the hands go up and people say, "Stitch finger, what's that? Does my machine have it?" And I never heard of it. What does it do? So let's clear up some of the mysteries about the stitch finger, because once you understand how the different components in your serger work, you will have complete control over what your stitch looks like, and you'll be able to adjust it stitch width-wise down to within a millimeter or less for the perfect looking stitch for your project. So let's go to the machine, and first we'll look at the stitch finger and talk about how it works. Here is our stitch finger, and it's right in back of the knife, which is right here. Now, as I mentioned before, all sergers have a stitch finger. The very first sergers that came on the market years and years ago had the stitch finger attached to the needle plate. And in order to remove it to do a rolled hem, you had to change the needle plate. Well, the manufacturers have gotten much more streamlined in their design, and they make it much easier now for us. There are still some brands where you manually will pop out the stitch finger with a lever and then replace it after you finish doing a very narrow stitch or a rolled hem. But you notice that the stitch finger is flat and it's metal. Not only does it control the width of the stitch in overlock mode only, it also keeps the fabric flat and smooth under a balanced stitch because it is a flat metal piece. And this can be moved simultaneously with my knife. Not all sergers will move both simultaneously, but it's a really nice feature to look for, simply because no matter what position your stitch finger is on, your knife will always be in the right position and cutting off the correct amount of fabric for your stitch width. Right now, I have my stitch finger and cutting width on a 9mm width. Let me move that in. You can see it moving left and closer to the needles, and the knife is moving with it. The closer the stitch finger is to the needles, the narrower the stitch will be from left to right. As I move it back out again, the wider the stitch will be. And I've run off a little bit of chain with a 4-thread overlock stitch. And you can see, before I put this on fabric, that serger chain is wide. It's 9mm. The maximum width on stitches varies from brand to brand of sergers, as well as different models. Yours may have a 7.5mm maximum width, or it may even be a little bit less. That is something you can check in your owner's manual. I have it on 9mm, and the stitch wraps around that stitch finger, and that's what keeps it wide. You can see that. Now, as I move the stitch finger in, I'm going to do a 9mm wide stitch on this fabric so that you can see that width. Get it right under here. I'm just going to skim off a little bit of the fabric, but you can see it. And I like to clear the stitch finger by pulling the chain off of the stitch finger to start with, because the fabric hasn't hit the needles yet, and it just prevents any kind of thread buildup on the starting edge of my fabric. Off, and let's take a look at that. There's that 9mm stitch. So let's compare that. I'm going to move the stitch width and cutting width dial. Let's move it down to 6 and then compare what that looks like. So I'm moving the dial down, and again you're seeing the stitch finger and knife move in closer to the needles for a 6mm wide stitch. So let's try that on the opposite edge, and then we'll compare them. Okay, so you can see a significant difference, a 3mm difference, a little bigger than 1/8 of an inch difference, 9mm and 6mm. And that's all from moving that stitch finger in closer to the needles. I mentioned earlier that the stitch finger is one of the components that governs the width of the stitch left to right in overlock mode. Another one is needle position. I'm going to cut my left overlock needle thread and remove that, and I'm going to remove that needle as well. That is going to automatically skinny down my stitch by about 1/8 of an inch. And what does that represent? That 1/8 of an inch is the space between the two needles. The farther away the needle is from your loopers and the wider stitch finger is, the wider the stitch will be. So by removing the left needle, I'm going to automatically skinny down my stitch by about 2mm, or approximately 1/8 of an inch. So let me just pull out that thread. And I've taken the thread right out of the machine. So automatically now I've skinnied down my stitch. I'm going to leave that stitch width dial on 6, but with just the right needle on, we're going to compare that to the 6mm stitch. Here's a comparison of having the 4-thread overlock with my left and right needle in. And here it is at 6mm with just the right needle in and the stitch finger still engaged. So you can see there's a significant difference. And this one is determined not only by the stitch finger position, but also the fact that I removed the left needle. So that has narrowed down the stitch a little bit too. What happens when we switch to a rolled hem setting? Let's take a look at that next. I still have my right needle only in. My stitch finger is engaged. Now I'm going to pull this lever back to R for rolled hem. And what I want you to watch is the stitch finger. It's going to be disengaged and disappear. It's going to pull back. And now it's not part of the stitch anymore. So again, if I have it engaged, it is up, you pull the lever back to R for rolled hem, and it's disengaged. That's going to narrow down my stitch left to right even a little bit more. And what does the stitch have to roll around to form? It's these very delicate stitch pins right here. And that is going to allow me to create the narrowest stitch of all on an overlock mode, and that's a rolled hem. The other component as far as what governs the width of the stitch in rolled hem mode, it's right needle for being closest to the loopers. I've disengaged the stitch finger, and increasing the tension on the lower looper thread is going to skinny down that stitch even more. We're looking at the screen, and I have selected a 3-thread rolled hem stitch number 8, and the yellow numbers indicate that I have changed the lower loop retention and increased it to 7.1. That's just a personal preference of mine. I like that lower loop retention a little bit higher than the default setting on the machine. So let's take a look at what it does. Let's look at the thread chain first without any fabric, and you're going to see how narrow it is. I use this stitch quite frequently when I like to make decorative serger chains with thick decorative threads, and I increase my stitch length to compensate for the thickness of those bold threads. But I'm going to just chain off a little bit with my serger cone thread in, and let's look at how narrow and delicate that serger chain is. You can see, rather than having a wider swath of a stitch, that stitch is just forming over the stitch pin, so it's very thin and delicate. Here it is, a perfect example of how narrow that stitch is. Now, I'm going to do this just on a single layer. I'm still using one of my other pieces of fabric, but I've opened up the second layer because typically when we do a rolled hem to finish an edge, it is on a single layer of fabric. I'm going to hold on to my thread chain till I'm on the fabric and just trim off a little bit. So let's take a look at this. Here is that very narrow stitch. And instead of the thread loops meeting, the upper looper and lower looper meeting precisely on the edge of the fabric, that higher tension on the lower looper thread has pulled the upper looper thread to the underside and rolled the fabric with it. And not having the support of that stitch finger has allowed that fabric to curl under and be pulled under with the stitch. So it's kind of a fun dance between all of those components that will govern the width of the stitch. Thanks for joining me today. If you have any questions or comments, leave them below and I'll get back to you quickly with an answer. You can always email me, Gail at gailpatrice.com. Happy sewing and serging.